what do you think really matters in economics right now? Like if you had to, maybe you have that list, but if you had to make a list of like the top three or maybe top five things or whatever that you follow most closely, what would that list look like?
It'd be undoubtedly energy policy at its core and the proliferation of energy ignorance on the part of Western political leaders, which is one of the big inspirations for starting Doomberg in the first place. Outside of that ring, sort of the next layer out of the onion, so to speak, would be the direct impact on food.
Okay, that's that's two things. Looking at them right now, energy policy impact on food. Where would you stand broadly on the thing? What do you see happening? Like, do you think we are leading into say a short-term spike in inflation, but later disinflation with pockets of deflation, or what are your general expectations here?
Well, it's called Doomberg, so it's important to keep that in mind as you listen to what it is that I'm about to say. Our political leaders in the Western world, take Germany, for example, are so naive and so ill-informed about energy policy that it's scary. Unfortunately, it feels like we have to suffer a lot more pain as a society before they get serious about it. And there will be an enormous amount of suffering because of a combination of our energy ignorance and our energy arrogance. Just today we have Germany begging its citizens to, use much less energy, wear sweaters, turn off the lights, consolidate to one fridge or whatever, when they've closed these nuclear power plants and they have three more on the chopping block. We put out a tweet this morning, like if every kilowatt hour counts, how many kilowatt hours can you get from the three nuclear power plants you just shut down? The fact that Germany is still resisting resuscitating those power plants tells you that the arrogance and ignorance is still very high, and the amount of suffering that needs to be dealt out to the citizenry is still going to be very high. And the worst part of all of this, of course, is that the elite who are making these policy errors will not suffer at all. It's the common person who will suffer.
I've been all over the place on this. I was in the inflation camp first, and then I'm speaking like over a period of just like a year. I was in the inflation camp first, then it was stagflation from there on, and now, to the best of my understanding, though it being poor, thanks to Menachem Sachler, by the way, on Twitter, I think, sorry about that, I think we're headed for deflation over the medium term, say 5-year period. So I'll explain, and I'll try to do it shortly, if that's okay with you, what I understand and why I think that we're headed there, and you can correct me or add your points to what I understand. Is that okay? That you do want to do that?
Sure.
Okay.
It's your show.
Yeah. Thank you. No, I mean, yeah. Thank you for that. First of all, it's important to say that when I'm talking about inflation, I mean monetary inflation, not price inflation. So I mean an increasing amount of money in circulation, which leads, monetary inflation, the way I understand, translates into consumer price inflation or asset price inflation, or asset price inflation. So if the amount of money in circulation stays stagnant and the prices of what we've seen so far, that be food and energy, are going up, which they are, then that would mean that the prices of something else in the economy, say something with an elastic demand, say yachts and mansions and private jets, for example, should be dropping. So although it might seem like inflation to me, to a lot of us really, that have the majority of our expenses going towards food and energy, food and energy is a huge portion of my balance sheet as someone who's not rich. It's not inflation in the technical sense unless the money supply is expanding. But so when I say deflation, I think the money supply might start dropping going forward. And that's because, I guess just a quick notice again, as far as I understand it, money creation, money is created in the commercial banking system. The Fed doesn't print money, government doesn't print money, Jerome Powell doesn't print money in his basement either. So the only institutions that can directly control inflation are technically commercial banks, but their lending, though, depends on many factors, including laws and regulations and interest rates as well, which is where respectively the government and the Fed can have an indirect influence on the money supply. But so in a nutshell, it comes down to, if the banks are willing to lend more, we'll see inflation. If they're not, we'll see deflation. Now, with prices rising in all the wrong places, as you just said, and then, food and energy, basically, this will kill the margins of a lot of companies. I have a small bakery over here in Belgium. Food and energy prices, it's not good for my margins, and it will decrease the value of my business. It will decrease the value of the collateral that I can post for a loan. It will kill my ability as a business, but I imagine many other businesses, to borrow money. It will kill my credit score, basically. And if you combine that with increasing interest rates, combine that with other supply chain destructions and issues, and now even war over here in Europe, and I just have a hard time believing that commercial banks will see the macro picture as improving from a risk perspective in the next 5 years, and will therefore be looking to lend more money. So I just don't see how that can happen. So I said a lot there. I was rambling a little bit too. So, but what do you think about that, Doomberg? Or what am I missing here?
I think there's two dimensions that maybe could expand your thinking. One is time horizon. So the whole fallacy of is inflation transitory is a propaganda diversion. We are in an inflationary environment today. It's just undeniable. Either measured by the expanding money supply or measured by what I believe is the true price, the true inflation measure, which is the price of goods that people need to live and to extract from the universe that we reside in a wonderful standard of living, which, as we've said on many podcasts, is, the human endeavor is a constant, unrelenting struggle against the forces of entropy, and the amount of energy and that you can waste in order to impose a temporary order on your local environment is the literal definition of your standard of living. And we view inflation as the cost of doing that. And so the two things that you're missing are time horizon. I don't doubt every inflationary shock in the history of humankind has led to a deflationary collapse and a reset of the economy. So of course, if you look at just Weimar inflation was transitory. It was only several years. It happened to be particularly violent, and it happened to have led to extensive human suffering. Given enough human suffering, we have no doubt that we will revert to deflationary pressures. At the highest level, the economy is a deflationary machine. The continuous improvement and technological development and the continuous uplifting of populations from around the world, for whom a day's labor is worth more to them and less to others. And these factors have been converging. Now, ultimately, the second part of it is, of course, there's the money supply divided by the available things to use that money supply to increase your standard of living. And so the denominator in your inflationary analysis is missing. So I view purely monetary definitions of inflation as incomplete. And if the world stopped producing oil tomorrow, we would have an inflationary nightmare, because the highest bidders, the richest people, would make the market clearing price of oil, several $100s a barrel, and that would crush the standard of living of many, many people, and we would be exporting that inflationary pressure to those who are least able to afford it. And so my counter to your summary is, on a long enough time horizon, of course, everything is deflationary. And then secondly, the denominator of the goods that money is chasing matters just as much as the growth of that money supply.
Okay, that's a good point. I also had a counter argument to my own argument, because it wasn't really an argument. So again, I'm trying to make sense of it out being all over the place. But a counterpoint could be, and it was made by Andy from Finding Value Finance on YouTube, also an underfollowed channel, by the way, so shout out to them. He made a point in one of his recent videos that we're currently in a credit expansion period. You cannot deny that. That's it. That credit expansion period is also mainly caused, that's one of the things that he follows very closely on an economic level that he thinks matters a lot. It's caused by an increasing demand for housing, which is currently outpacing the supply of housing. And so he says that we've never had deflation without a housing market crash. So he's actually not trying to predict what's going to happen, but he's pointing to the period in which we are right now. And he says, I'll believe this period is gone and that we are no longer in a credit expansion when I see it. I'll believe it when it happens. That's what he says. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I would point your listeners and your viewers to a great Twitter thread put out by Jim Bianca recently, which covered a similar concept. And Bianca Research on Twitter, really brilliant guy and huge following on Twitter, and certainly an account that when we open up Twitter in the morning is one of the first that we check every day. And he put out a thread basically making the point that the hysteresis effect of the response to the COVID-19 pandemic is more persistent than many modelers are currently contemplating. His belief is that the distributed nature of work is more permanent. The work from home is more permanent, which means, per your previous comment, that the value and demand of the housing stock is not yet going to abate, despite the fact that 30-year fixed mortgages in the U.S. are now touching 5%. And so, yeah, I do think that our response to the virus has permanently changed many of the ways in which we live, work, are entertained. And in fact, in our piece, Farmers on the Brink, the labor shortages that we talked about are because, people have learned that there are other ways to do work and to entertain themselves that don't require physical labor. And too many people are trying to do that. And not enough people are still doing the physical jobs that keep the blue collar jobs, that the trucking and the farming and the oil fields. There's a huge labor shortage in the oil patch in the US. These things seem to be more permanent than many macro economists were predicting. Many thought we would just sort of snap back once we had vaccines widely distributed and we could get back to normal. That has proven not to be the case. And we're still kind of working through the consequences of what that shift means. If some of the trends that Bianca highlighted in his tweet are in fact, from a history, the hysteresis effect is real and that this is going to be permanent, then we have some major changes to do. And one of those changes is much higher housing stock. People spent most of their days in offices and in classrooms in person, and that's changed now. And if those types of changes are going to be permanent, then we have to have a rethinking of the fundamental inputs into our models, the traditional economic analyses. And I do worry that the friction of the transition is going to be a challenging one.
This gives a good overview, I think a decent overview of where we stand right now. And also, some of those things I also don't think are going away. I am on Reddit, and sometimes I'd read, there's our Belgium Reddit. I'm in Belgium, so I obviously read that. I read a lot of people are adapting to the new sort of, it's not sort of regulations. What do I want to call it? Maybe, I don't think that's the right word, but where they would, at work, they would allow you to work 4 days a week instead of 5 days if you pick up a couple of extra hours each day. And then they would also allow you to choose whether you work from the office or from home. And most people that I read from are really loving it. And I cannot think of why not. Right. So it seems like a good deal for employees. And I don't see it going away, at least in Belgium, knowing the Belgian people too. I don't see it going away anytime soon. I think this is permanent. I think this is the shift of the shift in the working class of our time. That's the way that I spoken to my wife about it too.
A couple of examples of how we believe this to be true. We have a pretty good network at Doomberg, and one of our good friends is an expert in staffing and staffing companies and temporary work and contract work. And it's just undeniable that the traditional what is an employee model is forever altered. And also another area in other words, that this whole gig economy for brains that we talk about in the content creator space is true for all critical, traditional skills, accounting, finance, investor relations, public relations. These are all things that can be staffed up and staffed down as needed and can be outsourced. And what does it mean to be a corporation, even in this context, is going to come under some scrutiny. And then another area that we think is ripe for total disruption and perhaps even collapse is the university system. The manner in which people learn, and we wrote a piece called "America's Colleges and Universities Are Doomed." The NPV, the net present value of a college degree, the median college student in the U.S. is destroying value. And now you take away even the experience of on-campus learning. But the prospect that the median student in the U.S. in particular would engage in a value-destroying contract at a 4-year liberal arts school, that somehow this is going to persist during a period of economic uncertainty, I think is quite foolhardy. And so, whether it's the definition of what an employee is or who is an educated person, and how do we make these certification processes that are so critical to life success more egalitarian and more accessible to people, where effort is what matters, and not money, and not connections, and not politics, and not family. That is a system everybody should want. And to the extent that we have, scrambled the eggs here a little bit, and we have a chance to reset the way our society works, those are two areas that we're following very carefully.
Okay, yeah, this gives a good